When I use the word mysticism, I am referring to a kind of experience, a state of consciousness, shall we say, that seems to me to be as prevalent among human beings as measles. It is something that simply happens, and we don't know why it happens. All sorts of techniques claim to promote it and are more or less successful in doing so, but there is a peculiar thing that does happen to people. It is an experience that can actually be described from a number of quite different points of view, but we could add them up to a few dominant characteristics. One ordinarily feels that one is a separate individual in confrontation with a world that is foreign to oneself, that is not me. In a mystical kind of experience, though, that separate individual finds itself to be of one and of the same nature or identity as the outside world. In other words, the individual suddenly no longer feels like a stranger in the world. Rather, the external world feels as if it were his own body. The next aspect of the mystical feeling is even more difficult to assimilate into our ordinary practical intelligence. It is the overwhelming sense that everything that happens, everything that I or anyone else has ever done, is part of a harmonious design and that there is no error at all. Now, I am not talking about philosophy. I am not talking about a rationalization or some sort of theory that somebody cooked up in order to explain the world and make it seem a tolerable place in which to live. I am talking about a rather whimsical, unpredictable experience that suddenly hits people. An experience that includes this feeling of the total harmoniousness of everything. I realize that those words, the total harmoniousness of everything, can carry with them a sort of sentimental or Pollyanna feeling. There are various religions in our society today that try to inculcate the belief that everything is harmonious unity. They want, in a sense, to propagandize the belief that everything is harmonious. To my mind, that is a kind of pseudo-mysticism. I made up that word. It is an attempt to make the tail wag the dog, or to make the effect produce the cause, because the authentic sensation of the true harmony of things is never brought about by insisting that everything is harmonious. When you do that, when you say to yourself, all things are light, all things are God, all things are beautiful, you are actually implying that they are not, because you wouldn't be saying it if you really knew it to be true. So the sensation of universal harmony cannot come to us when it is sought, or when we look for it as an escape from the way we actually feel, or as a compensation for the way we actually feel. It comes out of the blue, and when it does, it is overwhelmingly convincing. It is the foundation for most of mankind's profound philosophies and for its mystical, metaphysical, and religious ideas. Someone who has experienced this sort of thing cannot restrain himself. He has to get up and tell everybody about it. And, alas, he becomes the founder of a religion, because people say, look at that man, how happy he is, what conviction he has no doubts, he seems so sure in everything he does. That is the wonderful thing about a great human being. He is like an animal or a flower. When a flower bud opens, it has no hesitation or doubts. When a young woman appears in society as a debutante, she is not quite sure if she is going to come off. She appears on the stage of society with some doubts in her mind, and therefore all appearances of this kind are rather sickly in nature. But when the bird sings, or the chicken egg breaks, or a flower buds, there is no doubt about it at all. It just comes forth. And so in the same way, when somebody has an authentic mystical experience, it just comes forth. He has to tell everybody about it, because he notices everybody around him looking dreadfully serious, looking as if they had a problem, looking as if the act of living were extremely difficult. But from the standpoint of the person who has had this experience, they look funny. They don't understand that there isn't any problem at all. The mystic has seen that the meaning of being alive is just to be alive. That is to say, when I look at the color of your hair and the shape of your eyebrow, I understand that their shape and color are their point. And this is what we are all here for as well, to be. It is so plain and so obvious and so simple, and yet everybody rushes around in a great panic as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. The funny thing is, they're not even quite sure what they need to achieve, but they are devilishly intent on achieving it. To the person who is in a state of consciousness I call mystical, this frenzy of activity all seems very weird and absurd. It is not to be criticized in an unkindly way, however. It's just a pity that they don't see their own absurdity. One of the funny things about them is that they don't realize that there is a dimension, a sense in which their pursuit is magnificent. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I want to turn that into its opposite in a way. I want to bless them, not forgive them, for not knowing what they're doing. I want to honor them, because the intensely serious preoccupations and anxieties of mankind appear to be not only absurd, but also a kind of marvel. They are a marvel in the same way, perhaps, that the protective coloring of a butterfly, which has somehow contrived to make its wings look like enormous eyes, is a marvel. When a bird that is about to devour it is confronted by those staring eyes, it hesitates a little, as you do when somebody stares at you. The butterfly appears to stare at the bird, and this phenomenon, the marvelous staring wings of the butterfly, seems to be a result of anxiety. The anxiety to survive all the problems and struggles of natural selection. And so in our intense struggle, we are perhaps all unknowing poets. One of the greatest ideas that has ever been produced is the Hindu idea that the world is a drama in which the central and supreme self behind all existence has gotten lost and has come to believe that it is not the one supreme self, but all the creatures that there are. It has come to believe in its own artistry. And the more involved, the more anxious, the more finite, the more limited the infinite manages to feel itself to be, the greater that artistry, the greater the depth of the illusion that it has created. All art, in a way, is illusion. The art of the magician is the art of directing illusion, but all art, be it painting or theater, relies on illusion. And so, the more anxiety there is, the more uncertainty there is, the more the universe has succeeded with this artistry. Just as when you are watching a play or reading a novel or viewing a movie, the more the author or actor manages to persuade you that the movie or novel is reality, the more he or she has succeeded as an artist. You may retain a faint recognition in the back of your mind that a play, for instance, is only a play, but when you are sitting on the edge of your seat and you are sweating and your hands are clutching the arms of the chair because the scene grips you, that play is magnificent art. The Hindus feel that the whole arrangement of the cosmos is exactly like that, when in actual life you are wondering whether your doctor is a competent surgeon or a charlatan, or whether your investments are good or bad. The Hindus believe that all those feelings of crisis are exactly the same feelings you experience when you are sitting in the theater. As the Hindus would say, that thing in you that is real and that connects you under the surface with every other living being, that thing is the player of all parts. It is the creator of the illusion. It is the source of the game that has got you so involved. And it is living it up in the same way the actors on the stage are living it up, and for the same reason, to convince you that the game is reality. Everybody loves to play this game, the game of hide and seek, the game of scaring oneself with uncertainty. It is human. It is why we go to the theater or movies, and why we read novels. And our so-called real life, seen from the position of the mystic, is a version of the same thing. The mystic is the person who has realized that the game is a game. It is hide and seek, and everything associated with the hide side of it is connected to those places within us where we as individuals feel lonely, impotent, put down, and so on, the negative side of existence. I've tried at various times to show that there is really one simple principle that underlies everything. All insides have outsides. You don't know that the inside is an inside unless there is an outside, and you don't know that the outside is an outside unless there is an inside. You, as you ordinarily experience yourself, are an inside. You are the animate, sensitive being inside your skin, but the inside of the skin goes with the outside of the skin. If there weren't an outside of the skin, there wouldn't be an inside. And the outside of the skin is the whole cosmos, galaxy after galaxy and everything else. And it goes with the inside in the same way that front goes with back. If you understand that, then you will truly feel the harmoniousness of everything, and that is the mystic's point of view. Now, if I may switch subjects a little, what is morality? Morality refers to a set of rules that are analogous to the rules of language. It is perfectly obvious that we can talk to each other in English, for instance, only if there is mutual agreement among ourselves as how to use the language, what words refer to what experiences, and how words are to be strung together as to be useful and meaningful. It is interesting that we humans don't have much trouble in coming to this agreement about language. The police don't have to enforce grammar. The school teacher sometimes has to enforce grammar with students and say in an authoritative way that they must use the correct grammatical forms. But when they grow up, we use these grammatical forms without much difficulty. Just as we have to agree in order to communicate about language, we also have to agree about the rules of driving on the highway, the rules of doing business, the rules of banking, the rules of family arrangements, and so on. These rules are of the same kind of the rules as grammar. But, alas, this similarity is not often recognized because the authority, the sanctions, the power behind these rules is different from the authority that underlies grammar. What I mean is this. If you transgress the rules of grammar, people just shrug their shoulders and say, well, he isn't making sense. They won't summon the police. But if you transgress the rules of the highway or of finances, someone is likely to call the cops. One senses the authority of the state behind those rules. There are other rules that have behind them the authority of not the state, but the Lord God Almighty. And if you transgress those rules, you are in danger, not simply of going to jail, but depending on your religious persuasion, of frying forever in hell. At the very least, you have shown yourself, lamentably, to be nothing better than a real person. Now, wherever the domains of mysticism and morality come into conflict, there is a problem. Throughout the history of religion, mystics have always been suspect. Religions and their priests have been the upholders of moral rules. They have been the guardians of moral authority in the same way as lexicographers or grammarians have been the guardians of the rules of language. But when the mystical experience appears within the domain of religion, the priests always become very disturbed. For example, in California, there was a strange outbreak within the Episcopal Church. Various congregations have experienced a phenomenon called glossolalia. I'm not sure how to pronounce this word. Bear with me. Glossolalia, which means speaking in tongues. If you turn on your radio on a Sunday night to any African American revival meeting, you will hear this. The preacher begins by talking sensibly, but then as the congregation gets more and more enthusiastic, saying, "Amen, yes, Lord, teach on that," the preacher works himself up to the point where he isn't talking sense anymore. He's just wailing, shouting, and celebrating the glorious nonsense of the universe. In other words, all of the dry theological categories become poetry, as well as something beyond poetry, music. The preacher has become at that moment as one with the universe, because he is doing exactly what the stars are doing. The stars above and the galaxies are not making sense. They're just pouring out into the sky in a colossal display of fireworks. Well, in recent months, various congregations in the Episcopal Church have had outbreaks of this. The Bishop of California, Bishop Pike, wrote an encyclical letter to his pastors that said, in effect, that we must not be too dogmatic. We must recognize always that the Spirit of God may work in mysterious ways that cannot be foreseen. We should keep an open mind about all these matters. This message was presented in a very complicated way, requiring several pages. But then, despite those sentiments, when it came to the question of the validity of speaking in tongues, the encyclical said, in no uncertain terms, this must not happen in the Episcopal Church. This with an iron hand in Bishop Pike's velvet glove. This has been the characteristic attitude of priests and guardians of law and order throughout the ages. Everything, as they say in the Episcopal Church, should be done decently and in order. The guardians of this kind of law and order have always been afraid of the spontaneous manifestations of the Spirit, not simply of things like mysticism, but also of things like falling in love. This leads to an absolutely astounding paradox. We know that human love is genuine only when it is felt in the depth of the heart, and we know that this is true whether it be love for another human or love of God, and of course we are always looking to receive genuine love. We don't want others to love us because they were forced to. We want them to love us because they really do love us in their hearts. When you study the history of the Hebrews, which underlines Christianity, you will discover two traditions constantly compensating for one another and playing off of each other: the priestly tradition and the prophetic tradition. The priesthood is concerned with the external observance of laws. The prophetic tradition is concerned with the internal motivations behind actions. Prophets constantly condemn the meaningless adherence to law as hypocritical. In this sense, Jesus is the greatest of the prophets. Even if a man has never committed adultery, the prophet says that if he looked at a woman with lust, he has already committed adultery in his heart. To really obey the law, in other words, you must obey it with your feelings and not just outwardly. For as Jeremiah says, "The day will come when no man shall any more say to his brother, Know God," that is to say, know the law of God. "But they shall all know me, for I will write my law in their inward parts." The ideal, in other words, is the person who does not simply obey the rules, but whose desires are transformed from the heart. To have the law written on the heart means to change one's desire. And this peculiarly paradoxical situation exists within the established church, being required or forced by law to be loving, while at the same time being required to feel that love in one's heart. This is where the astonishing conflict between the mystic and moralist occurs. For the mystic knows that he has to be more than the legalist. He has to do more than outwardly observe the law. Luther said that the law that requires inward compliance is the most terrible thing. A great deal of his philosophy was an attack on the idea that one's inner feelings could be commanded, because the moment you subscribe to the idea that your inner feelings should be commanded, you open the door to hypocrisy. If you tell others that you love them simply because you know you are supposed to love them, but in your heart you don't love them at all, then you are a liar and a hypocrite. And the more you insist on that lie, and the more you feel it is your duty to change your feelings and love others, the deeper and deeper you get into trouble. The truth will come out. You will not be able to sustain the pretense. You will not have sufficient energy to go on pretending and making a mockery of the feeling of love. And if you are honest, you will have to say at last, "I don't love." It doesn't matter whether you have to say this to some other human being or in a religious situation. If you have to sit back and say to the Lord, "Lord, I don't love you. I think you are a bore. You are demanding. You are an authoritarian. You are domineering. I probably ought to love you, but I don't." Now we are afraid that an honest expression of our feelings would be disruptive to law and order, but it wouldn't, not in the least. Actually, it would contribute to law and order. I was once associated with a business person who was very complicated. He always pretended that he was a great idealist and that whatever he was doing was for the benefit of mankind, for the furtherance of mutual understanding, and to promote unselfishness and love between human beings. Actually, his dealings were very shady ethically, and I couldn't get along with him because he wouldn't come clean. If he had said, "Look, I'm in a jam, and in order to get around it, I need you to manipulate things with me, thus and so. I know this isn't ethical, but this is what I need you to do," I would have said, "Well, I'm entirely in agreement with you." If he hadn't come on in his usual pious ways, which I found sickening and offensive, but had come out in a human way, we would have understood each other. This example shows that real honesty is a genuine basis for morality. Real honesty means not pretending that your feelings are other than they are. Sometimes we may have to do things that go against our feelings. For example, you may have to help people whom you don't like and you don't want to help. Don't be dishonest. Don't say that your feelings are different from what they are. And we can perhaps understand something about the deep relationship between morals and mysticism. If we go back to the mystical experience that I described earlier in terms of the harmoniousness of everything, we can see that such harmony applies to human behavior too. Its ups and downs are no different in principle from the behavior of the clouds, or the wind, or dancing flames in a fireplace. When you watch the pattern of the dancing flames, you see that they never do anything vulgar. Their artistry is always perfect. Ultimately, it is the same with human beings. We are just as much of the natural order as flames in the fire or stars in the sky, but this is only apparent to the person who is honest, in the sense in which I have been using that word. The person who is tied up with trying to pretend that his feelings are other than what they actually are can never see this. He will always be a troublemaker. He is the original hypocrite. The one who is most destructive is the person who pretends to be a model of love and rectitude and justice when in fact he isn't, and nobody really can be. Altogether superior to the hypocrite is the person I call the loving cynic, who knows of course that everybody has weaknesses, but who isn't contemptuous of anyone for that reason. A book that illuminates the meaning of a loving cynic is Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by C.G. Jung. It is the autobiography of a man who was a superb human being, in the particular sense of thoroughly knowing his own limitations and having a sense of humor about it. Jung was a man who understood how to integrate into his being the devilish and compulsive aspects of his nature. In the metaphysical sphere, the mystic is one who feels that everything that happens is in some way right, is in some way an integral, harmonious part of the universe. Now, when we transplant or translate that idea into the moral sphere, the sphere of human conduct, the equivalent insight is this: there are no wrong feelings. There may be wrong actions in the sense of actions contrary to the rules of human behavior. But the way you feel toward other people, loving them, hating them, and so on, is never wrong, and it's absurd and dishonest to try to force your feelings to be other than they are. The idea that there are no wrong feelings is immensely threatening to people who are afraid to feel. This is one of the peculiar problems of Western culture. We are terrified of our feelings because they take off on their own. We think that if we give them any scope, if we don't immediately beat them down, they will lead us into all kinds of chaotic and destructive actions. It's funny that we in our Western culture today believe this, we who do more chaotic and reckless things than any other culture has ever done before. If instead we would accept our feelings and look upon their comings and goings as something that is beautiful and as natural and necessary as changes in the weather or the sequence of night and day or the four seasons, we would be at peace with ourselves. Because what has been problematic for a Western man is not so much his struggles with other people and their needs and problems, but rather his struggles with his own feelings, with what he will allow himself to feel and what he won't allow himself to feel. He is ashamed to feel profoundly sad. It is unmanly to cry. He is ashamed to loathe somebody because he has been told not to hate people. He is ashamed to be overcome with the beauty of something, whether a natural landscape or a member of the opposite sex, because being overcome means not being in control. As a result of this repression, he ends up going out of his mind. We are always out of control when we don't accept our feelings, when we try to pretend that our inner life is different from what it really is. The most releasing thing that anybody can possibly understand is that our feelings are never wrong. They may not be a correct guide to how we should act, of course. If you feel that you hate somebody intensely, it isn't necessarily right to go up to that person and cut his throat. But it is right that you should have the feeling of hate. For you see, when a person comes to himself, he comes to be one with his own feelings, and that is the only way to control them. The sailor always keeps the wind in his sail. Whether he wants to sail with the wind or against it, he always uses the wind. He never denies the wind. In the same way, a person has to keep in contact with his own feelings, whether he wants to act as his feelings obviously suggest or in a different way. He still has to keep his feelings with him because they are his own essential self. As soon as he abandons his feelings, he has lost himself. He becomes an empty mask with no reality behind it, and all his protestations of love and goodwill will be hollow. If a woman has a child conceived by accident, she may think, I really don't want to have this baby, and I don't want the responsibility, but I mustn't think those thoughts. All good mothers love their babies, and so she says to her child, I love you. But her milk is sour and the baby becomes confused. It would be much better if the mother said to the baby, listen, you are a pest and a nuisance and I don't want you. Then they would understand each other. Everything would be clear. There would be no confusions and no one would feel mixed up. And because when you feel that somebody is a pest and a nuisance and you tell him so, you are apt for a while to develop a kind of humorous feeling about your irritation with him. After a while you might even start saying, you old bastard, with a kind of affection. The point is, through their honesty, both the adult and the child keep in touch with their true feelings, and instead of denying a different situation, they face it, and may in fact grow out of it. So, what the mystic feels while in the mystical state of mind is the divinity, the glory of everything that is. And when we apply that mystical insight to the moral sphere, it is one's genuine feelings that are divine and glorious. Therefore, these genuine feelings must always be admitted, must always be allowed. Let me emphasize once more that this doesn't mean that we are therefore always compelled to act upon our feelings, to kill people we hate, for instance. On the contrary, conscious hatred need not lead to violence at all. In fact, it is most often unconscious hatred that leads to violence. What I am saying is that it is the recognition and acceptance of what one honestly feels that is the moral equivalent of the mystic's vision of the divinity of existence.